Long before printing presses and leather-bound Bibles, the stories of Jesus were passed from lips to ears, from parchment to memory, like precious embers carried from one house church to another. Some were told around dinner tables lit by olive lamps, others whispered in candle-lit caves beneath Roman cities. And while the Gospels we now know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were cherished early on, they weren't the only ones being read. If you could wander into a second-century Christian community in Egypt or Syria or Asia Minor, you might have heard someone unrolling a scroll titled not John, but Thomas, or Mary, or even Peter. They too told stories about Jesus. His sayings, his actions, sometimes even his childhood misadventures involving clay birds and stern glances. So, what happened? Why do we only have 4 Gospels in the Bible when it seems early Christians had more? Were the others banned? Were they lost in a fire? Were they locked away in some dusty Vatican basement guarded by sword-wielding monks who had taken a vow of literary silence? Not quite. The truth is gentler, quieter. Like most things in early Christianity, it has more to do with scattered communities, handwritten copies, and a deep desire to preserve what was true, what was really true, even when the world was shaking. The idea of a standardized New Testament didn't arrive overnight. In the beginning, the church didn't have a table of contents. It had scrolls, letters, memories, and lots of prayer. Imagine for a moment sitting in a crowded room in Ephesus around the year 120. There's a teacher reading aloud from a parchment that's been copied and recopied by candlelight. It starts with the words, "These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke, and Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down." There's not the Gospel of Matthew. There's the Gospel of Thomas. A real text discovered centuries later in a clay jar buried beneath the Egyptian desert, and it's just one of many. You see, early Christians weren't trying to write bestsellers. They were trying to hold on to hope. Some communities passed along sayings they believed came straight from Jesus, even if they weren't included in the well-known Gospels. Others created entire stories to teach, to encourage, or perhaps just to imagine. The line between reflection and invention wasn't always easy to draw, especially when scrolls were rare, travel was slow, and persecution was never far away. And so, like stars in a crowded sky, many Gospels appeared, some bright and lasting, others fading quickly into the shadows. Some were treasured, some were doubted, some were strange. A few were loved for a season and then quietly forgotten, like lullabies from childhood. But they were all part of the larger story, the search, the memory, the longing to understand who Jesus really was. And today, many of those forgotten Gospels still whisper from the margins of history. They don't shout, they don't demand, but they remind us that the early church was never neat or tidy. It was a tapestry threaded with passion, confusion, revelation, and trust. And before we talk about why some books were left out, we must first remember that they were there to begin with. In the early centuries of Christianity, nobody handed out style guides or theological checklists for writing a gospel. There were no official branding rules like, please begin with a genealogy and end with a resurrection. And yet, somehow, over time, the church began to recognize that not all Gospels were created equal. So what made a gospel? A gospel, it wasn't the quality of the parchment or the elegance of the Greek. It wasn't even how fascinating the content might seem to modern readers. What mattered most to the early church wasn't novelty, it was trust. deep, lived-in trust, the kind that comes from knowing a story has been carried faithfully from the lips of someone who was actually there, or someone close enough to know what really happened. There were a few basic guideposts, nothing written in stone at first, but quietly affirmed by churches across miles and decades. The first question was, is this gospel connected to the apostles? That didn't mean every gospel had to be written by one of the original 12, but there had to be a credible link. Mark, for example, wasn't an apostle himself, but early tradition held that he wrote down the memories of Peter. Luke was a companion of Paul. John, of course, was believed to be the beloved disciple himself. Second, is this gospel consistent with what we already know about Jesus? Early Christians weren't trying to suppress creativity. They just knew Jesus wasn't confusing. He might be mysterious, but he wasn't contradictory. So when a gospel popped up that said Jesus never suffered, or that Judas was actually the hero, or that salvation could be earned by solving esoteric riddles, well, people started asking questions, and not with pitchforks and torches, but with careful, thoughtful discernment. Communities wanted to protect the Jesus they knew, not invent one that fit better in a philosophy textbook. Third, is it being used broadly? The early church didn't exist in one city with a shared Dropbox folder. It was spread out, from Jerusalem to Antioch, from Rome to Alexandria. And when communities thousands of miles apart were already reading the same gospels, quoting the same stories, and structuring their worship around the same narratives, that was a sign, not a rule book, but a strong, quiet confirmation. These are the ones that have stood the test. It's worth remembering that this process took time. There wasn't a secret gospel elimination tournament where texts were disqualified round by round. Instead, there was something softer, organic, communal. Pastors, bishops, and everyday believers slowly realized which texts nourish the church and which ones left it confused, fragmented, or just unsettled. Some of the writings that didn't make the cut weren't malicious, they were imaginative, even poetic, but like fan fiction, passed off as biography, they often strayed from the core of who Jesus was and is. The Jesus who walked roads with dusty feet, spoke in parables, wept over friends, and rose from the dead was too important to be rewritten. So when we ask, what made a gospel worthy of inclusion, we're really asking something deeper. What made a story trustworthy enough to carry our faith? And the early church, in all its imperfections, somehow managed to listen. Not just to the words on a scroll, but to the Spirit, to each other, and to the Jesus they loved. Not every gospel told the story the same way, and not every gospel made it into the book you now call the New Testament. Some were too late, some were too strange, and some, like a voice in the wrong key, simply didn't harmonize with the tune the early church had been singing since the apostles first walked the roads of Galilee. But that doesn't mean they disappeared. Take, for instance, the Gospel of Thomas, discovered in 1945 near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi, yes, in a jar, as all mysterious things should be. It's not really a narrative at all. It doesn't tell the story of Jesus' birth, his death, or his resurrection. It's just sayings, 114 of them. Like fortune cookie theology meets desert mysticism. Some are familiar. Love your brother as your soul. Others are more cryptic. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. One even ends with Jesus saying that Mary will become a man to enter the kingdom, which, needless to say, raised more than a few early Christian eyebrows. Then there's the Gospel of Peter. This one was found in the 19th century, buried in the sands of Akhmim, Egypt. It gives us a version of the resurrection that feels more like an ancient superhero movie. In it, Jesus walks out of the tomb flanked by two giant angels, so tall their heads reach the sky. And behind him the cross follows, yes, talking. Early church leaders read this and politely declined to include it in the canon. It wasn't that they lacked imagination, it's just that they remembered the resurrection as profound and mysterious, not theatrical. And we mustn't forget the Gospel of Mary. A beautiful text in many ways. It gives voice to Mary Magdalene, portraying her as a leader among the disciples and a recipient of hidden wisdom. It suggests she understood Jesus in ways others didn't. But its theology leans heavily into Gnosticism, the idea that salvation comes through secret knowledge and escape from the physical world. That wasn't the faith the apostles had preached. They had touched Jesus' wounds. They believed resurrection wasn't escape from the body, it was the redemption of it. There were many others too. The infancy gospel of Thomas gives us a mischievous young Jesus who strikes a child dead for bumping into him, then later resurrects him like a cosmic do-overs. The Gospel of Judas paints Judas not as a traitor, but as the only disciple who truly understood Jesus' plan. These texts weren't just different, they reflected entire worldviews, often shaped by Gnostic philosophy or second-century speculations far removed from the dusty roads of Palestine. It's tempting to see these Gospels as rejected audition tapes, like contestants cut from the final round of a sacred talent show. But that's not quite right. They weren't all written with deceit in mind. Some were sincere attempts to explore the mystery of Jesus through reflection, metaphor, or even imagination. Others were more philosophical, crafted by communities who believed matter was evil, the soul needed liberation, and Jesus was more ghost than human. The early church didn't respond with rage, it responded with discernment. Leaders like Irenaeus, writing in the late 2nd century, defended the 4 canonical Gospels as the ones the church had always trusted. He didn't just point to their content, he pointed to their use. These were the texts read aloud in worship, copied by hand, memorized by heart, and sealed in the blood of martyrs. And over time, the ones that didn't align, whether in timing, teaching, or tone, were quietly set aside. Some were preserved in desert jars or monastery shelves. Others were lost to fire, time, and neglect. But all of them, in their own way, tell us something. Not just about Jesus, but about the people who were trying desperately, reverently, to understand him. In a way, these forgotten Gospels are like abandoned footpaths. Some veer off wildly, some circle back on themselves, but all of them remind us that the early Christian world was not a silent, monochrome place. It was alive with voices, searching, questioning, remembering. And the ones we hold on to today, those were the stories that echoed loudest in the hearts of those who knew him best. It's a question that sparked documentaries, novels, and late-night internet rabbit holes. Were certain Gospels banned from the Bible? Was there a secret meeting, maybe with candlelight, cloaks, and ominous background music, where a group of powerful bishops crossed their arms and declared, "Let us remove these books and hide them forever"? It's dramatic, suspenseful, and not exactly how it happened. There was no ancient version of a corporate boardroom with a vote on which Gospels make Jesus look best. The process of forming the New Testament was slower, quieter, and surprisingly human. The truth is, No one banned the Gospel of Thomas. They just didn't read it aloud in church. It wasn't used in worship across most regions, and in a time when communities were sharing stories of Jesus under threat of arrest or exile, the texts they held onto were the ones that helped them endure, not the ones that puzzled them. Now, that's not to say controversy didn't exist. It did. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, debates about what should be read aloud in the churches were heating up. Figures like Irenaeus and Origen started making lists, not to gatekeep truth, but to clarify which writings reflected the apostolic witness and which didn't. Still, there was no master list from heaven. No golden envelope opened at the first annual Council of Gospel Selection. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, often blamed for deciding the New Testament, didn't actually vote on which books belonged. In fact, the canon wasn't finalized until much later. By the late 300s, Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, wrote a letter listing the 27 books we now call the New Testament. It wasn't a new invention, he was simply naming what had already become the settled norm in churches across the Roman world. But what about suppression? What about the Gnostic texts found in the sands of Nag Hammadi? Why were they buried? The answer is surprisingly mundane. Most likely, they were hidden by monks from a nearby monastery after Gnostic writings were officially discouraged by church leaders. Not burned, not outlawed with imperial stormtroopers, just quietly buried to avoid conflict. And then forgotten, like old journals tucked into an attic. When they were discovered in 1945, the world was surprised, but the early church, they had already moved on. And yet, some of those forgotten texts still echo. They don't overthrow Christian faith, but they do add color to the landscape, like faded sketches beside a masterpiece. They show us how wide the conversation once was, how many people tried to grasp the mystery of Jesus in their own way. Some veered off course, some got lost in history's shuffle. But now, at last, the last fountain has been ringed. So no, the canon wasn't shaped by suppression, it was shaped by survival. The books that stayed were the ones that fed the soul, grounded the community, and told the story that matched what the earliest Christians already knew. That God had come close, walked among them, died and rose again. If you're imagining shadowy councils tossing gospels into bonfires, try instead to picture a candlelit room, a weary pastor reading aloud a scroll worn thin by tears and time. People gathered, listening, hoping, remembering. And when that reading ended in resurrection, they nodded yes. That's the Jesus we know. If you were to walk into a small house church in Antioch in the 2nd century, candles flickering, clay oil lamps casting shadows on plastered walls, you might hear someone reading aloud from the Gospel of Matthew, or perhaps Luke, maybe even John. The words would sound familiar to you, not just because you read them, but because they were shaping the hearts and memories of people across the ancient world. But back then you wouldn't have called it the Gospel of Matthew. You would have simply said, the Gospel, singular. There was one message, one good news, but told from 4 different angles. And that's exactly how the early church came to understand it. Still, it begs the question, why 4? Why not 7? Or one definitive gospel that just smushed them all together into a single neat narrative. In fact, someone tried that. His name was Tatian, a 2nd century Christian from Syria. He created a harmony of the 4 Gospels called the Diatessaron, literally through 4. It combined all 4 accounts into one continuous story. No genealogical debates, no duplicate parables, just one smooth reading. It was popular for a time, especially in Syria, but it didn't stick, because something subtle and beautiful was lost in the process. The four Gospels weren't just different tellings, they were different rhythms. Matthew echoed the Jewish scriptures, steeped in fulfillment and prophecy. Mark was brisk, urgent, written like someone trying to get the news out before being arrested. Luke, with his historian's heart, interviewed eyewitnesses and stitched together details like a doctor tending to wounds. And John wrote like a man trying to bottle lightning. His words float between heaven and earth, trying to describe something almost too glorious for grammar. These weren't contradictions, they were harmonies. Four instruments playing the same melody but with their own timbre and tone. And that mattered to the early church. Irenaeus of Lyons, writing in the late 2nd century, argued that just as there were four winds, four corners of the earth, and four faces of the cherubim in Ezekiel's vision, so too were there to be four Gospels. It wasn't a math problem. It was a portrait, one too rich to be painted with just a single brush. There were other Gospels, of course, as we've explored, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Mary. But they didn't carry the same weight. They weren't read aloud in every city. They didn't bear the fingerprints of apostolic authority. Many of them emerged later, decades after the apostles had already left this earth. Some leaned heavily into Gnostic ideas, less about God entering the world in flesh and blood, more about escaping the physical world altogether. The four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were different. They had been written early, circulated widely, and most importantly, they had been trusted. From Ephesus to Rome, from Jerusalem to Alexandria, these were the Gospels that churches clung to in persecution, copied under candlelight, and whispered to one another in prison cells. They weren't chosen at a council, they were recognized, like hearing the voice of a friend in a crowd. They were already known by those who walked with Christ. And perhaps even more remarkable, the early church didn't try to iron out the differences. They didn't fix the stories to match. Matthew says Judas hanged himself. Acts says he fell and burst open. No one smoothed it over. No one edited the Sermon on the Mount to match the one on the plain. They left it, not because they were careless, but because they understood something profound. Truth is not always uniform. Sometimes it's textured, faceted, like a diamond that catches light in different ways depending on the angle. By the 4th century, when canon lists became more formalized, the four Gospels were already firmly embedded in Christian memory and liturgy. They weren't voted in. They had already taken root. In a world where stories were often bent to serve kings, gods, or movements, the Gospels stood apart. They didn't flatter the disciples. They showed their flaws. They didn't present Jesus as a conqueror, but as a crucified Messiah. They weren't just stories about God. They were stories through which people encountered God. Not just then, but now. So why four Gospels? Because one story wasn't enough to contain the fullness of the Word made flesh. Because God, in His wisdom, allowed different voices to speak a single truth. And because the Church, through centuries of worship, suffering, and memory, recognized those voices as the ones worth passing down. And tonight, somewhere in a quiet corner of the world, one of those Gospels is being read again, aloud, gently, maybe by candlelight, just as it was 2,000 years ago. If you could sit down beside a candlelit scribe in the 2nd century, parchment spread before him, ink gently drying on his reed pen, and ask him, "How do you know which books are inspired?" he might pause, look at you, and respond, not with a definition, but with a story. Because for the early church, inspiration wasn't primarily about word-for-word dictation from heaven or thunderous declarations from the sky. It wasn't an ancient version of divine email. It was more organic, mysterious, lived. The word inspired came from theopanoist. Literally, God breathed. And the early believers knew what it felt like when something carried the breath of God. When they heard the Gospel of John read aloud in a gathering, there was a hush in the room. Not because it was eloquent, though it was, not because it was poetic, though that too, but because it sounded like Jesus. It echoed with the same heartbeat that had changed their lives. When the letters of Paul circulated, letters written to real churches with real problems, they didn't treat them like philosophical essays. They clung to them, quoted them, sang their phrases in worship. They even read them alongside the Hebrew scriptures, not because someone told them to, but because they could sense it. These words weren't just helpful, they were holy. But let's be honest, inspired is a word that gets thrown around a lot. Today it might describe a painting, a speech, or even a well-brewed cup of coffee. But for the early church it meant something much deeper. It meant that a text didn't just inform, it transformed. It didn't just talk about God, it somehow carried his presence. It didn't just preserve memory, it became a living word, shaping hearts, convicting spirits, and calling people to worship. Oh, of course, not every text passed this test. Some writings, like the Gospel of Peter, were dramatic and gripping but veered into the bizarre, like a talking cross walking out of the tomb. Others, like the Gospel of Thomas, leaned towards secret sayings and mystical riddles, leaving many listeners more confused than comforted. These texts might have fascinated a few, but they didn't unite the church. They didn't endure across time and region. They weren't read in worship by persecuted believers facing lions and exile. And they didn't carry that unmistakable weight of divine breath. Inspiration in those early centuries wasn't determined by a theological checklist, but by communal discernment. Church fathers like Origen and Athanasius wrote about it, yes, but the decision wasn't made in ivory towers. It was felt in prisons, tested in martyrdom, whispered in catacombs, and sung under stars. Communities didn't just keep the books they liked. They preserved the ones they trusted, the ones that had held them when the world fell apart. By the 4th century, as the church gained more structure, the criteria for inspiration became more clearly articulated: apostolic origin, consistency with the rule of faith, wide usage in worship, and spiritual fruit. But those were just the written forms of what the faithful already knew. These books, these letters, these gospels, they weren't just historical accounts or moral lessons. They were alive. They had traveled far, across deserts and seas, from house churches to cities, from scrolls to hearts. And somehow, through all the copying and carrying, they had remained whole. No wonder Paul once called Scripture useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness. It wasn't just useful, it was necessary. It breathed. So, what made a gospel inspired? It wasn't just who wrote it, though that mattered. It wasn't how old it was, though age had a voice. It was whether the voice behind the words was still speaking, whether, in the silence between the lines, the Spirit could still be heard. And tonight, As your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts drift between past and present, that same breath still stirs. Not in thunder, but in the quiet turning of pages, in the whisper of truth recognized even in the dark. In December of 1945, two Egyptian brothers digging near the village of Nag Hammadi stumbled upon a sealed clay jar buried beneath the desert sands. It was the kind of jar you might expect to hold oil or maybe grain. But what they found inside was far stranger. 13 leather-bound papyrus codices, preserved almost miraculously for over 15 centuries. When scholars finally opened them, they discovered something astonishing. Texts that had been lost for over 1,000 years. Gospels, but not the ones you know. There was Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, and perhaps most tantalizing of all, the Gospel of Mary, attributed to Mary Magdalene, long speculated about in legend and fiction alike. These texts weren't unknown in the ancient world. Early church fathers like Irenaeus and Origen had referenced them, usually with strong warnings. But until the Nag Hammadi discovery, we had no complete copies. Just names, just fragments. And then suddenly an entire library emerged from the ground like a time capsule of forgotten faith. So what do these lost Gospels actually say? Let's begin with Thomas. Unlike Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, the Gospel of Thomas doesn't tell a story. There are no parables, no crucifixion, no resurrection, no miracles. Instead, it reads like a list. 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, some echoing familiar gospel words, others drifting into cryptic riddles and enigmatic wisdom. Split a piece of wood, one line reads, and I am there. Lift up the stone and you will find me there. It's poetic, mysterious. Some sayings sound eerily similar to the synoptic gospels. Others feel like they were written during a very late-night philosophy class. Scholars debate its origins endlessly. Some argue Thomas contains ancient traditions, even oral sayings that may predate the canonical Gospels. Others suggest it's a 2nd century Gnostic reinterpretation, shaped by a very different spiritual lens. In truth, it may be a bit of both. Then there's the Gospel of Mary. Not Mary, the mother of Jesus, but Mary Magdalene, the woman so often misunderstood by history and Hollywood alike. In this Gospel, Mary is portrayed not only as a disciple, but as one of Jesus' most trusted voices. She comforts the grieving apostles. She recounts visions and teachings that Jesus supposedly shared with her alone. Some disciples, especially Peter, struggle to accept her authority. Did he really speak these words to a woman and not openly to us? Peter asks incredulously. It's a poignant scene, one that scholars say may reflect early tensions in the church around women's leadership, especially in communities influenced by Gnostic thought. Ah, yes, Gnosticism, a word you've likely heard if you've ever wandered into the dustier corners of ancient Christian history. Gnostic texts often emphasized secret knowledge, gnosis, as the path to salvation. The physical world was seen as corrupt or illusory, created not by a good God, but by a lesser, flawed deity. The true divine spark, they believed, lived trapped inside the human soul, waiting to be awakened through insight. In these writings, Jesus is often more of a heavenly revealer than a suffering savior. The cross is minimized, the resurrection is internalized, and the body, often considered irrelevant or even a prison. This isn't to say that all non-canonical texts were Gnostic. Some were simply alternate tellings, community favorites, or theological experiments. The Gospel of Peter, for example, offers a dramatic resurrection scene complete with a talking cross. an image that feels more theatrical than theological. The infancy gospel of Thomas, not to be confused with the other Thomas, tells stories of a young Jesus striking children dead and raising them back again, something that probably didn't make it into your childhood Sunday school class. Though why weren't these included in the Bible? It wasn't because the early church wanted to hide something scandalous or silence certain voices. It was because these writings, while sometimes fascinating, didn't bear the same marks of authenticity, apostolic connection, or wide communal trust. They often reflected beliefs that diverged significantly from the faith handed down through the apostles, especially when it came to who Jesus was, what he came to do, and what salvation actually meant. And yet, their rediscovery matters because they remind us that early Christianity was not born in a vacuum. It was forged in dialogue, tension, debate, and devotion. There were rival voices, rival visions. There were questions, so many questions. And over time, through prayer, worship, and experience, the church found its voice. Not by erasing the others, but by listening carefully for the one that matched what had been seen, heard, and lived. These other gospels remain valuable, not as scripture, but as windows. Windows into the longings, confusions, and spiritual creativity of those who were trying to make sense of the Jesus they had encountered or heard of. They are mirrors of a world still echoing with questions about truth, authority, and what it really means to follow the Word made flesh. So as we sift through these fragments from the desert, some brilliant, some bewildering, we're not hunting for conspiracy. We're witnessing the breadth of spiritual searching. And in that search, we remember why the church clung so fiercely to the four voices it did, because not every voice that mentions Jesus reveals him. And not every gospel is good news. If you've ever assumed that one day a group of bishops got together, sat around a table and said something like, "All right, let's vote on which books get to be in the Bible," you wouldn't be the first. It's a common picture. Partially thanks to medieval legends, modern fiction, and a few dramatic documentaries. But the real story of how the canon, the official collection of biblical books, was finalized is slower, more organic, and frankly more beautiful. You see, the early church didn't start with a table of contents. It started with testimonies, eyewitnesses, letters, scrolls passed from hand to hand, city to city. Some churches received Paul's letters, others had Mark's gospel. Still others treasured poetic hymns and creeds now tucked into books like Philippians and Colossians. These writings weren't instantly labeled scripture, but as they were read in worship, copied, quoted, and treasured, a shared recognition began to form. These weren't just helpful words, they were sacred ones. By the mid-2nd century, early church leaders like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus were already distinguishing between the Gospels and other writings. They spoke of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as a unified witness, 4 pillars, not many. Around the same time, a wealthy Christian named Marcion tried to create his own edited Bible. He kept parts of Luke and some of Paul's letters, but rejected anything too Jewish or too earthy. The church quickly responded, not by inventing the canon out of thin air, but by reaffirming the books that had already been cherished. Marcion's strange remix may have actually pushed the church to clarify what was truly foundational. By the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, church fathers like Origen and Eusebius began categorizing texts. They used phrases like acknowledged, disputed, and heretical to sort them. Books like the Gospels, Acts, and Paul's letters were widely accepted. Others, like Revelation or Hebrews, had more mixed reviews, depending on the region or theological perspective. And still others, like the Shepherd of Hermas or the Didache, were beloved by some but never quite made it into the inner circle. Then came the year 367 AD. Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, wrote his famous Easter letter. In it, he listed the 27 books of the New Testament exactly as we have them today, no more, no less. It wasn't a new decree, it was more like an announcement of what had become the common practice among the faithful. His list didn't carry legal authority across the whole Christian world, but it was a major milestone. It reflected a growing consensus that had been forming, not over years, but centuries. Shortly after, councils like Hippo, 393 AD, and Carthage, 397 AD, echoed Athanasius's list. Again, these weren't councils inventing the canon. They were recognizing the books that had already proven themselves through use, devotion, and theological clarity. There was no secret vault of banned texts, no midnight shredding of Gnostic scriptures, just a long, reverent process of listening to the voice of Christ as it echoed through generations of worshippers. It's easy to forget that the canon wasn't shaped in comfort. It was forged during persecution, exile, and theological struggle. It passed through the hands of martyrs, scribes, desert monks, and bishops under threat of death. These books were not chosen for entertainment or prestige. They were preserved because they carried truth. Truth that held the early church together when everything else was falling apart. Even the Old Testament had a long road. Jesus and the apostles quoted from the Hebrew scriptures constantly, often referencing the Septuagint, a Greek translation that included books like Tobit and Wisdom. Over time, the boundaries of the Old Testament canon would be clarified differently by Jews, Catholics, and Protestants. But that's a story for another night. By the time the dust settled, the New Testament canon had not been dictated from above. It had been discerned, tested in the fires of history, refined through worship, and received by faith. And while the Church has continued to wrestle with interpretation, translation, and tradition, the foundation has held. So the next time you hold a Bible in your hands, remember, it's not just a book. It's a testimony, not to human cleverness, but to divine persistence. A library of spirit-breathed words that survived empires, schisms, deserts, and doubts. It didn't fall from the sky. It was gathered carefully, prayerfully, faithfully. And that long, sacred gathering still whispers across the centuries, inviting you not just to read, but to listen. By now we've wandered through deserts and candle-lit catacombs, peeked inside ancient jars and dusty scrolls, sat beside bishops and scribes who lived in times we can barely imagine, and still, one question hums quietly in the background. Does any of this really matter? After all, we're not reading by torchlight or hiding from Roman soldiers. We have printed Bibles in every color and language. We have apps with daily reading plans, devotionals, Greek lexicons, and built-in highlighters. Why should it matter how these texts came to be? And yet, it does. Because behind every verse we now casually scroll through is a long chain of real people who fought to preserve it, who died believing it, who copied it by hand, line by line, word by word, sometimes with frozen fingers in monastic silence, sometimes with trembling hands as enemies approached. The Bible didn't just appear, it survived. And more than that, it formed people, it shaped communities, inspired movements, corrected kings, comforted slaves, challenged empires, and transformed hearts. It isn't just a historical document. It's a living story, one we've been grafted into. Knowing where our Bible came from reminds us that our faith isn't shallow. It's rooted in centuries of careful listening, debate, prayer, and devotion. The canon wasn't chosen to control people. It was chosen because it gave life, because these words pointed people toward Jesus, consistently, powerfully, and undeniably. The Gospels that didn't make it often pointed inward, towards secret wisdom or mystical detachment. The ones that remained pointed outward, to a crucified Savior who touched lepers, forgave enemies, and rose again in broad daylight. Can't expect anything else. It took death to transform. That's what it truly took to transform. And that's still the invitation. In a world flooded with content, overwhelmed with opinions, and addicted to speed, the story of how the Bible came to be reminds us to slow down, to listen carefully, to remember that truth isn't always loudest. It's often found in the quiet repetition of lives transformed over time. Maybe you've doubted your faith, or wondered if this ancient book still has something to say to your modern life. That's okay. In fact, it's welcomed. The early church was filled with questions too. What mattered is they kept showing up. They kept listening. They kept returning to the story. And now, that story has made its way to you. So as your eyes grow heavy and your mind begins to rest, may you be reminded that you're part of something ancient and ongoing. A story carried on scrolls, sealed in jars, whispered in caves, and now, streaming softly through your headphones. The Bible isn't just a book to be read, it's a gift that's been given. And somehow, even across time, even in your weariness, even with your questions still unanswered, it's still speaking.